Written by you/It's Time Ladies. I see a boy whenever somebody dies the second encounter. I was 8 when I met him the second time, just 3 years later. My family had always been rather dysfunctional, I think. My memories of what my mom and dad were like before the accident mainly consisted of them arguing about things I was too young to understand. There were long nights when I'd lie in bed next to my brother and listen to them yell at one another for hours on end before one of them stormed out of the house. After Mom died though, things were different. My dad wasn't really a paternal type, even before everything that happened. Most days he'd leave for work in the morning, and wouldn't come back home until midnight. He spent his days off out in the bar, and I'd hear him stumble around the hallways late at night when he got home. I liked to pretend that he was a ghost. We at least had a babysitter for a little while, but once my older brother turned 13 and my little sister grew out of diapers, he didn't think it was necessary anymore. He rarely ever spoke to me, and I remember catching him glare at me from time to time when he was at the house. I suspect that he blamed me for Mom's death. While he was out of the house, my brother was considered the man, but that mostly consisted of him barking orders at me to do his chores, and hitting me when I wouldn't comply. Throughout most of the day, he'd sit on the couch and play those violent video games Mom hated so much while I sat on the floor and watched as he mowed down hordes of innocent civilians. My sister, who was scared of my brother and the constant sounds of gunfire and screams that erupted from the TV, would spend most of the days in her room upstairs playing with her dolls. The day the boy came for the second time was a Saturday in the middle of summer, I remember. Dad was gone before I'd woken up, and my brother was already at the TV when I came downstairs, playing some new war game he'd stolen Dad's credit card to buy. I remember I wasn't in the mood to sit and watch that day, and decided to spend it reading in my room. Later on around the early evening I got hungry, and went back down into the kitchen. Dad would always bring home groceries on Sunday afternoon, so by Saturday everything in the kitchen was picked clean. Still, I looked for anything suitable for a meal, finding nothing but a few snack packs and a small bag of potato chips. I sighed, and decided to confront my brother about it. "What do you want, shithead?" he asked without looking at me. I noticed his eyes were bloodshot, and I started to wonder how long he had been sitting there. The water bottles lying on the floor filled with yellow liquid made me think he hadn't moved all day. "I'm hungry," I said, trying to sound tough. "Make dinner." My brother sneered at me. "What do I look like, a fucking butler? Fuck off. Dad put you in charge," I continued, starting to get agitated. "You need to take care of us." "Will you shut the fuck up?" he asked as his face twisted into a look of anger and determination. "I'm almost finished with this level and I don't need your bitching right and fuck," he shrieked, as an enemy jumped into the screen and killed his character. In a fit of rage, he grabbed one of the bottles off the floor and threw it at the wall next to the TV. It collided with a picture of Mom and Dad on their wedding day, causing it to fall to the ground and shatter. We both paused, staring at it for a second in silence. My brother took a long sigh before turning to look at me. "Clean that up," he demanded. "No. Make dinner." I don't know why I felt so angry, but I was determined to stand my ground. My brother glared at me and was about to reply, when a weird look came across his face. "All right, bitch," he said with a wicked grin as he leaned forward. "If you're so hungry, then why don't you eat this?" Quickly, his hand shot down and grabbed one of the other bottles on the floor, and before I could react he'd already managed to twist the cap off and pour the contents onto my head. I froze in shock as he cackled. The urine was still warm, and some of it had gotten into my mouth. I was going to say something, but I realized that I was shaking and I knew I was going to cry soon. Ashamed and humiliated, I ran back into the kitchen before he could see the tears. I turned the sink handles up the furthest they could go, hoping the sound of the faucet would drown out my sobs as I washed my hands and rinsed out my mouth. Luckily, I could hear the sounds of his video game starting back up, so I don't think he was paying attention anymore. Once I felt clean enough to turn the water off, I decided that what little food we had left would have to do, and after grabbing the chips and the snack packs I went back upstairs. I ran through the front room before my brother could do anything else to me. I was still wet with urine, and I was probably tracking it, but I didn't care. Once I got up the stairs, I was going to go to the room my brother and I shared first thing to stash the food, before heading to the bathroom to shower. I was stopped though, when I saw that my sister was standing at the frame of her door, looking up at me with wide, pitiful eyes. Probably drawn out by the commotion. "Oh," I muttered, pausing for a moment as I was unsure what to tell her. It was then that I realized she wasn't looking at me, but at the food in my hand. Um, are you hungry?" I asked, and she looked up at me almost fearfully before she nodded her head. She was always shy when people asked her questions. I looked between her and the food for a few seconds, figuring out what to do. I could feel my stomach ache from emptiness, but in the end I sighed before handing it all to her. She was a little girl, and I figured she needed it more than me. She hesitated for a second, as if I was going to snatch it back from her when she tried to take it. But after a while she finally raised her tiny arms up and let me drop it into them, before running back into her room and shutting the door without even saying thank you. Standing in the hallway alone and hungry, I groaned before heading to the shower, where I stayed for what felt like hours as I washed the urine out of my hair and face. Afterward, I threw my clothes in the hamper and returned to my room, locking my door behind me. I figured my brother could sleep on the couch and smell his piss all night. If he even went to bed, that was. I was going to try finishing my book, however the heat of the warm shower mixed with the general lack of energy made me drift to sleep faster than I'd expected. As I shut my eyes, the last thing that came to my mind before I fell asleep was that there was a familiar scent in the air, the one that I couldn't place, an ashy smell, like that of a dying fire. I don't remember how long I was out, but I do remember being woken up by a strange voice. "Hey kid. You gotta get up," he said as I shifted in bed. I opened my eyes to see a figure sitting at the end of my bed. I couldn't tell who they were in the darkness, but their figure was far too tall and lanky to be my brother. "Who are?" I mumbled, before freezing up at the realization that a stranger was sitting on my bed. "Come on," he said, sounding almost hurt. "Are you saying you don't remember me?" He then leaned in closer and reached out to my nightstand to turn on my lamp. "Maybe you'll recognize my face." The light flicked on, and I realized that the two of us were now sitting face to face. I saw his pale white skin and silvery white hair, and immediately the memories that I had repressed in the past 3 years came back to me. I started shaking, and I was going to scream before he put a finger near my mouth to silence me. "Don't be so loud, okay? Your dad's home, and he's really angry with your brother. I saw them fighting downstairs before I came to see you. If you scream, you'll make him mad at you too, and you don't want that, do you?" Frightened by both him and that prospect, I shook my head no. What do you want?" I whispered. He seemed to perk up at that, as a smile spread across his face. "I want to play a game with you," he said simply. My eyes widened as I processed that. "Huh?" I asked. "You heard me. Are you any good at hide and seek?" I was still too confused to answer. This guy broke into my room just to play a game with me? "I don't know," I muttered. "Aw, don't sell yourself short, kid. I played it with your sister before coming in here, and she found me pretty easy. I'm sure you can hide better than I can," he said, more encouragement in his voice than I'd heard from my father in the past 3 years. I didn't know what to do. I felt helpless between having to play with this guy, or running out and having to deal with Dad. With no other options, I decided it was best to go along with him. "Okay. I'll play," I mumbled. He sighed, as though he was relieved that I agreed, before looking back at me with his big grin. "That's a good boy. Now, I'm going to close my eyes and count to 10, and you're going to hide somewhere, all right?" I nodded my head, and he closed his eyes and started counting out loud. 1, 2, 3. As he counted, I stood up and looked around my room for a proper hiding space. My eyes settled on my closet, and I figured that it was the best place. Quietly, I slid the door open and crept inside before closing it. For good measure, I slipped behind a crate of old toys I'd grown out of. Then I waited for him to finish counting. 8, 9, 10. Right at that moment, I heard a loud banging as my door was kicked open, which made me jump so hard I almost knocked my head against the crate. I could hear the sound of heavy, unsteady footsteps stomping into the room. "Boy. Where the fuck are ya?" a booming voice called out, and I froze up. It was my father, and from the sound of his voice he'd been drinking a lot. The door to the closet was open a sliver, and I could see the shadow of my father as he stumbled around my room, tearing it apart. "Get the fuck out here so I can give you what you deserve," I whimpered as he smashed something glass onto the floor. From where I was lying I also see the boy, sitting on my bed and watching my father destroy my room without flinching. Then, after a few seconds he turned in the direction of the closet, and I could swear he looked directly at me and smiled, before grabbing something from the bed and throwing it to the floor. My dad froze up, and as the boy got up from the bed he growled and marched right up to it, grabbing the bed frame and flipping the whole thing over. In the process, the lamp fell from the nightstand on the other side, and half of the room went into darkness. My father's demeanor seemed to change then. His breathing got heavier as he realized I wasn't under the bed, and soon after he fell to his knees. To my surprise, he began sobbing. "Jesus Christ!" he muttered in between cries. "What the fuck am I doing?" Hesitantly, I slid the closet door open, and was about to go to console him when I saw that the boy was at his side, rapidly shaking his head at me before he put his finger to his mouth, signaling to me to keep quiet. I obliged, shrinking back into the darkness, and as I did he leaned down and patted my dad's back sympathetically. After he did, my father stopped crying, and just stood there for a few more moments before getting up and leaving my room silently. He never noticed me. "Should I go after him?" I whispered to the boy as I crawled out of the closet and joined him, looking down at the door that my father had smashed off the hinges in his drunken rage. "Absolutely not," he answered, before kneeling down to the level of my face. "You know, you're pretty good at hiding. If you hadn't barged in on us, I don't think I would have found you." Against everything, I could feel myself blush. "Oh, thanks," I muttered. He chuckled before he stood back up and started toward the door. "I've gotta go now, kiddo. Do me a favor and stay right here in this room, okay? You'll understand why in a little while." I didn't want to stay in that trashed room, but something in my gut told me I should listen to him. "All right. Bye," I said awkwardly while giving him a little wave. He smiled and waved back, before walking through the doorway and out of my sight. A part of me wanted to run after him, but I just stood there. A few minutes later, I heard the front door burst open, and somebody screamed in horror before calling for an ambulance. A few minutes later, a policeman saw me sitting in my room reading, and escorted me out. He told me to keep my eyes closed as we went through the living room. The full story, as I later found out, was that my dad came home drunk that night and got into a fight with my brother over something. It could have been the smell of piss that was all over the living room, the smashed portrait, the fact that he was using his credit card, or he could have just been drunk and mad. We'll never know, but by the time my dad was done with him he was a barely recognizable lump of flesh. My sister, who had gone downstairs from her room for some reason, suffered a similar fate. After he was done and he couldn't find me, he must have sobered up and realizing what he'd done went into his bathroom and slit his wrists out of guilt. At some point, our neighbors filed a noise complaint. I didn't have much to say when the police questioned me about it. I didn't tell them about the boy this time, as I knew they wouldn't believe me and I was scared they'd think I was crazy. Instead, I simply told them I heard my father coming and hid in my closet until he left. They didn't say anything else. Now an orphan, I was taken in by a distant aunt that I'd never met before, who was considered suitable only because she and her husband were apparently two of the only adults in my family who weren't on meth. They tried their best to make me feel welcome in those first few months, but all I could do was think about that boy. Why had he helped me escape my father's wrath? What did he want from me? I wanted to see him again to find out. I wondered if I had to take matters into my own hands to do it.